Frank Sinatra opened the taxi door and slid into the back seat. Pulse said. The vinyl was cracked, tape holding splits together. The cab smelled like old cigarettes and cheap air freshener. A Wednesday night in New York City, October 1971. Rain hammered the windows, the kind of rain that turns streets into rivers, that makes the city lights blur into watercolor streaks. The driver was old, maybe 70. Gray hair thin on top, thick glasses, shoulders hunched forward from decades of sitting behind a wheel. He didn't turn around, just pulled into traffic without a word. The radio played low, a Sinatra song, Strangers in the Night. Frank settled into the corner of the back seat, collar up, hat pulled low. He was dressed simply, dark jacket, no tie, just a man trying to move through the city without being noticed. At 55, he'd learned how to disappear when he needed to, how to be invisible in plain sight. The driver reached forward and turned the volume up slightly. The song continued, Frank's own voice filling the cab. He always found it strange, hearing himself like this, removed from the moment of creation, filtered through cheap speakers, becoming part of someone else's life without them knowing he was sitting 3 feet away. The driver made a sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh, something bitter. Then he spoke, his voice rough, damaged by years of shouting over traffic and breathing exhaust fumes. I hate this guy. Frank stayed quiet, watched the back of the driver's head. Rain streaked the windows. The windshield wipers struggled against the downpour. The driver continued, unprompted, talking to himself more than to his passenger. Frank Sinatra. Everyone loves him. Everyone thinks he's so great. Voice of a generation, romance, class, all that garbage. He turned the radio off. The sudden silence felt heavy. I can't stand him. Haven't been able to for 40 years. Frank didn't move, didn't react. Just watched the city slide past through rain-blurred glass. Neon signs, dark storefronts, people huddled under awnings, the taxi's headlights cutting through the darkness. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror. Frank kept his face turned toward the window, hat obscuring his profile. You probably think I'm crazy, the driver said, old man hating on some singer. But I got my reasons. Frank said nothing. Sometimes silence was the best response. Let people talk. Let them fill the space. You learned more that way. The driver merged onto a wider street. Traffic moved slowly, red taillights stretching ahead like a chain. 40 years ago, the driver said, I was married, beautiful woman, Maria. We were young, happy, had a little apartment in Brooklyn. Nothing fancy, but it was ours. He paused. The rain intensified. Thunder rumbled somewhere distant. Maria loved music, loved dancing, and she loved Frank Sinatra, had all his records, would play them constantly, while cooking, while cleaning, all the time, that voice filling our apartment day and night. The driver's hands tightened on the steering wheel. One day she was playing one of his songs, The Way You Look Tonight, and she said something. She was joking. I know that now, but I didn't know it then. She said if Frank Sinatra ever asked her to run away with him, she would. She laughed when she said it. Like it was the most absurd thing in the world. Like obviously it would never happen. He went quiet for a moment. The taxi stopped at a red light. Rain hammered the roof. But I didn't laugh. I got angry, really angry. Started yelling at her about respect, about loyalty, about how she shouldn't joke about things like that even if they're impossible. She tried to calm me down. Tried to explain she was kidding, but I wouldn't listen. I was young and stupid, and proud. The light changed. The taxi moved forward. I gave her an ultimatum, told her she had to choose, me or Frank Sinatra's music, told her if she really loved me, she'd throw out all those records, never listen to him again, prove her loyalty. The driver's voice cracked slightly. She looked at me like I'd lost my mind, and maybe I had. She said she wasn't going to throw out her records because I was being ridiculous, so I told her if she wouldn't choose then I was leaving. Packed a bag that night, walked out, waited for her to stop me, to apologize, to choose me. He turned onto a quieter street, brownstones, trees lining the sidewalk, branches bare and dripping. She didn't stop me. I stayed with my brother for a week, kept waiting for her to call, to say she'd gotten rid of the records, to say I was more important than some singer she'd never meet, but she never called. The driver's reflection in the rearview mirror showed his jaw clenched. After a month, I went back to the apartment, to talk, to try to fix things. But she was gone, moved out, left a note, saying she couldn't be with someone who didn't understand the difference between a joke and a threat. Someone who valued his ego more than her happiness. Frank watched the streets pass, listened. Every word landing with weight. I tried to find her, went to her sister's place. Her parents, they wouldn't tell me where she was, said she needed space. Said I'd hurt her deeply, and she needed time to heal. I kept trying, for months, then years. Eventually, I stopped. Figured she'd moved on, maybe met someone else, maybe got the life she deserved. The taxi turned another corner. They were getting closer to Frank's destination, but he didn't mention it, didn't interrupt. I never remarried, drove this cab for 40 years. Every single day, I hear Frank Sinatra on the radio, in restaurants, in stores, everywhere, and every time, I remember that fight. Remember walking out, remember losing the only person I ever really loved because I was too stupid and proud to understand she was joking. The driver's voice had dropped to almost a whisper. So yeah, I hate Frank Sinatra. Not because of anything he did, but because every time I hear his voice, I remember the worst mistake of my life. The moment I chose my ego over everything that mattered. The taxi slowed. They'd reached Frank's hotel. The doorman stood under the awning, waiting. The rain had lessened slightly, but still fell steady. Frank didn't move to get out. Sat there in the back seat, watching the driver's reflection in the rearview mirror. An old man carrying 40 years of regret, blaming a voice on the radio for his own choices. Frank reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his wallet. The fare was $12. He took out $500 bills. Crisp, new. Then he pulled out a pen and a piece of hotel stationery he'd been carrying. He wrote carefully. Not long, just a few lines, folded the paper around the bills. Then he leaned forward slightly, spoke for the first time since entering the cab. His voice quiet, unrecognizable without the microphone, without the performance. Keep the change. He placed the folded paper and money on the front seat, opened the door, stepped out into the rain. The driver picked up the paper, confused by the weight of it, unfolded it, saw the money first, $500. His hands shook. Then he read the note. Maria lives at 447 Bergen Street, Brooklyn, apartment 3B. She never remarried. She talks about you sometimes, about the records, about the fight, about wishing you'd come back. It's not too late. The joke was never about choosing him over you. It was about loving both the music and the man. You were always the choice. You just didn't stay long enough to understand that some mistakes can be fixed. This is one of them. The address is real, so is the chance. Below the message, a single line, P.S. She still has the records. The driver read it twice, 3 times, his hands trembling, his vision blurred. He looked up, turned to the back seat, empty, looked through the rain-streaked windshield, saw a figure in a dark coat and hat disappearing through the hotel entrance. Something about the way the man moved, the shape of his shoulders. The driver's breath caught. He looked at the note again, the handwriting, the words, the kindness of a stranger who'd sat silent for 20 minutes, listening to a bitter old man blame him for something that was never his fault. The driver sat in his cab, engine idling, rain falling, holding $500 and an address he'd spent 40 years wishing he had. That night he didn't go home, drove to Brooklyn instead, to Bergen Street, parked outside a brownstone with a light on in a third-floor window, sat there for an hour, gathering courage, wiping tears from his face, holding the note like a lifeline. Finally he got out, climbed the steps, found apartment 3B, raised his hand to knock, paused. 40 years. So much time, so much regret. What if she didn't want to see him? What if the note was wrong? What if this was just cruelty disguised as kindness? But he knocked anyway, because some chances only come once, and maybe this was his. The door opened. A woman stood there. Older now, gray in her hair, lines around her eyes, but still Maria, still the face he'd seen in his memory for 4 decades. She looked at him. Recognition took a moment. Then her eyes widened. Her hand went to her mouth. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then she said his name, just his name, soft, questioning, like she wasn't sure he was real. He tried to answer, Couldn't. Just held out the note. She took it. Read it. Looked at him again. You came, she said. I should have come 40 years ago, he managed. I was wrong. About everything. About the records. About the joke. About leaving. I was so wrong. She stood there. He waited for her to close the door, to tell him it was too late, to send him away. Instead, she stepped back, opened the door wider. Come in, she said. I just made coffee. He walked in. The apartment was small, warm. In the corner, a record player. Next to it, a stack of albums. He could see some of the spines. Sinatra, still there. After all these years. She saw him looking, said quietly, I never threw them out, couldn't. They reminded me of us, of the good times before that last fight, of dancing in the kitchen, of being young and happy. They sat, talked. Hours passed. The rain stopped. The city grew quiet in that way it only does in the deepest part of night. They talked about the 40 years, where they'd been, what they'd done. She'd moved around, different jobs, different cities, always alone, always wondering if he'd ever come looking, always keeping those records, just in case. He told her about the cab, about hearing Sinatra every day, about the bitterness that had poisoned him, about blaming the wrong person for his own mistake. She listened, didn't interrupt. When he finished, she reached across the small table and took his hand. We were both young, she said, both stupid in our own ways. You for leaving, me for not fighting harder to make you stay, for letting pride win. I don't deserve forgiveness, he said. Maybe not, she agreed, but I'm giving it anyway, because 40 years is long enough. Because we're old now, because life's too short to hold on to anger. They sat in silence, comfortable. The kind of silence that only exists between people who understand each other completely. Finally she stood, walked to the record player, put on an album. The needle dropped. Music filled the small apartment. Sinatra's voice, The Way You Look Tonight. She turned to him, extended her hand. Dance with me, she said. He stood, took her hand, and they danced in that small apartment, two old people who'd lost 40 years to pride and misunderstanding, found again by the voice they'd fought about so long ago. When the song ended, they didn't separate, just stood there holding each other, silent. Thank you, he whispered. Don't thank me, she said. Thank whoever gave you that address. That was real kindness, real grace, the kind that doesn't ask for anything back. He thought about the man in the back of his cab, the quiet stranger who'd listened without judgment, who'd somehow known where Maria lived, who'd given him this chance. He thought about the handwriting on that note, the careful words, the understanding, and he thought about the figure disappearing into the hotel, the way he'd moved, the voice saying keep the change, a voice that had sounded oddly familiar even though he'd only heard it for 3 words. No, impossible, but maybe. The next morning, the driver, whose name was Anthony, didn't go back to driving his cab, called his dispatcher and retired. 40 years was enough. He spent the day with Maria instead, talking, catching up on 4 decades, making plans, small plans, maybe dinner next week, maybe a movie, maybe seeing where this could go. Days became weeks, weeks became months. They were old, they'd lost so much time, but what they had left, they spent together, not trying to recreate what they'd had, creating something new, something informed by age and regret, and hard-won wisdom. Anthony never forgot the stranger in his cab, kept the note, folded carefully in his wallet, a reminder that kindness existed, that second chances were possible, that sometimes the people you blamed for your problems were the ones who could help you fix them. Months later, he saw an interview with Frank Sinatra on television. Maria was there. They'd made dinner, were sitting together on her couch. Their couch now. Frank was talking about New York, about how he loved the city, about riding in cabs sometimes just to hear people talk, to understand lives different from his own. Anthony leaned forward, studied the face, the eyes, the way he moved his hands when he talked. Maria noticed. What is it? That night, Anthony said slowly, when I got the note, the passenger, I never saw his face, but his voice, and the way he moved, and how he knew where you lived. Maria looked at the television, at Frank Sinatra being interviewed, then at Anthony. You think? I don't know, Anthony said, but the handwriting, the kindness, The fact he gave me $500. The fact he'd somehow found your address. They sat in silence, watching the interview. Frank talked about music, about performance, about trying to connect with people, about how the best songs were about human truths, about love and loss, and finding your way back. The interviewer asked if he ever regretted anything in his career. Frank paused, considered, then said something that made Anthony's breath catch. I don't regret the performances. I don't regret the songs. What I regret are the times I could have helped someone and didn't. The times I stayed silent when I should have spoken. The times I had a chance to make a difference in someone's life and walked past. Those are the regrets that stay with you. The interviewer asked for an example. Frank smiled, shook his head. Some things you do privately, not for recognition, not for credit. You do them because they're right, because someone needs help and you can give it. That's all. Anthony looked at Maria, she looked at him. They didn't say anything, didn't need to. If it was him, and maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, he'd given them back 40 years, not the 40 they'd lost, the 40 they still had left. That was a gift beyond measure, beyond thanks, beyond anything they could ever repay. So they didn't try, just lived, together, making up for lost time, dancing in her small apartment, playing those old records, the ones she'd never thrown away, the ones that had caused so much pain, and ultimately brought them back together. And sometimes when Sinatra's voice filled the room, Anthony would think about that rainy night, about the stranger who'd listened without judgment, who'd somehow understood that blame was easier than accountability, that it's simpler to hate a voice on the radio than to face your own mistakes. He'd think about the note, the careful handwriting, the grace of giving someone information that could heal without asking for anything in return. And he'd remember the last line, the PS that had seemed like such a small detail but meant everything. She still has the records, because that's what the stranger had understood, what Anthony had been too bitter to see. Maria keeping those records wasn't about choosing Sinatra over her husband. It was about refusing to let anger destroy beauty, about protecting something she loved even when it caused pain, about hope that someday Anthony would understand the difference between the music and the man, between what he'd done and what he'd blamed. She'd been waiting for 40 years, playing those records, hoping, and the stranger had known. Somehow, he'd understood everything from a 20-minute cab ride and a bitter old man's confession. That was wisdom, real wisdom. The kind you can't learn from books or teachers, the kind that comes from living, from making your own mistakes, from understanding human nature deeply enough to see through anger to the hurt beneath. Frank Sinatra gave thousands of performances in his life, sang for millions of people, received awards and accolades, made his mark on musical history. But that rainy Wednesday night in October 1971, he did something more important than any performance. He listened to a bitter old man in a taxi, understood his pain, and gave him back his life. Not dramatically, not with grand gestures, just with an address and a note, and the understanding that some mistakes can be fixed if you're given the right information and the courage to use it. Anthony lived 15 more years. 15 years he spent with Maria. They married again. Small ceremony, just them and a few friends, danced to The Way You Look Tonight, both of them crying, both of them grateful. When Anthony died, peacefully in his sleep, Maria beside him, he was buried holding two things, his wedding ring, and that note, the one he'd received in a taxi on a rainy night, the one that had changed everything. At the funeral, Maria told their story, about the fight, about 40 years apart, about the stranger who'd brought them back together. She didn't say who she thought the stranger was. Didn't need to. Everyone who heard the story understood. Some kindnesses are too perfect to be coincidence. After the funeral, Maria went home, put on a record, sat in her chair, the one Anthony had sat in so many nights over their last 15 years together. The music played, Sinatra's voice filling the apartment. But this time there was no pain in it, no regret, just gratitude for the beauty of the music, for the years they'd had, for the stranger who'd understood that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is a second chance they don't think they deserve. Maria lived 7 more years. When she died, she requested one song at her funeral, The Way You Look Tonight. When it played, everyone in attendance understood. This wasn't just a song, it was a memorial to a love that had endured, to a mistake that had been forgiven, to a stranger's kindness that had changed 2 lives. Among the mourners was a man in his 70s, well-dressed, quiet. He stayed in the back, didn't speak to anyone, just listened to the song, watched the celebration of 2 lives that had found their way back to each other. When it was over, he left quietly. No one noticed. No one asked who he was. But if they had looked closely, they might have recognized the face. Older now, but still familiar, still carrying that quality of someone who understands human nature deeply, who's lived enough to know that judgment helps no one but kindness can change everything. Frank Sinatra never spoke publicly about that taxi ride, never mentioned Anthony or Maria, never claimed credit for their reunion. That wasn't the point. The point was understanding that sometimes your voice, your real voice, not the one that filled concert halls, could matter more than any performance. That listening was more important than singing. That true artistry wasn't just about how you used your talent, it was about how you used your humanity. Anthony blamed Frank Sinatra for 40 years, hated the voice that reminded him of his biggest mistake. In the end, that same voice or the man behind it gave him his life back. That's what grace looks like, not grand gestures, not dramatic interventions, just one person understanding another's pain and doing what they can to ease it. No reward, no recognition, just the quiet knowledge that you helped, that you made a difference, that someone's life is better because you took the time to care. Frank Sinatra sang for millions, but that night, in a rain-soaked taxi, he did something more valuable. He listened, he understood, he acted, and 2 people got 15 years they'd thought were lost forever. That's worth more than any standing ovation, more than any award, more than any recognition. That's what it means to use your voice for something that matters. Not the voice that sings, the voice that speaks truth, that offers hope, that reminds people they're not alone in their pain, that some mistakes can be fixed, that it's never too late, that grace exists, that second chances are real. Who have you blamed for your own mistakes? What voice do you hear that reminds you of your regrets? And more importantly, what would you do if someone handed you an address and a chance to fix what you've broken? Because that opportunity exists, not through strangers in taxis, through your own courage to face what you've done, to stop blaming others, to take responsibility, to reach out, to try. Anthony did. It changed everything. The question is, will you?